Well, good morning again. I think that that's a good segue into what I'm going to be talking about in regards to the message, because I think that Sabbath and rest and finding that thing that God's given us as a gift is something we don't think about in those terms. In fact, after the last service and after Bible study, a number of people came up to me and shared comments with me that I hadn't really considered, but in different ways of looking at what it means to rest, what the word Sabbath means, and all of those things. Because when I would say, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, many of you would say that you recognize that from the Ten Commandments, right? Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And you would recognize that it comes from the command that God gives to us that began in Deuteronomy. That when God was giving the Ten Commandments to his people, and when he told Moses, these are the commands I want you to inscribe, to take down to the people, that one of them was this idea of taking a day and setting it apart. Can we go to the next slide? The idea that God has given us these commands, and it started with Moses and the Israelites and carries through to today. So if I said remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, I think that many of us would have different ideas of what that means for us today. I had some conversation after Bible study, and we were talking about just a minute ago, like many times, and how I was taught that meant, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, I was taught that meant that you're supposed to go to church. That the idea of keeping that commandment was going to regular worship. And depending on the context and the situation and the people, this commandment has had different meanings at different times. But the thing is when God gave us this commandment, it was consistent in what he was saying. And when we think about the Ten Commandments, and we think about the commandments that we keep, and that we try to do a good job of keeping that, like some of them are pretty easy. Like I'm pretty sure that this morning, none of you have killed anyone. Fair enough? I'm just talking about today. Nobody's probably stolen anything yet, right? Now, some of them maybe, I don't know about honoring your father and mother, there's a lot of kids here, maybe. But the reality is, my point is, certain commandments, we know what they mean, we know if we've kept them. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. It's like not even on our radar most of the time on something that we're processing. And it's interesting because this idea of having a Sabbath day and keeping it as part of our lives has been built in literally since the beginning. But I think part of the problem is we struggle with rest. We struggle with what that means. Because we are in a culture where we always have things to do. We always have commitments to keep. We have a lot of responsibilities. And so rest, when it comes, is often something that we're longing for, but don't always feel like we got the rest we needed when we get it. Here's what I mean. How many of you have said after a vacation, I need a vacation from my vacation? Right? Aren't vacations supposed to be restful? Or, you've got a trip, a work trip or something, and you're thinking, okay, well, there's going to be work, but a few days away, it'll be nice. I'll feel a little relaxed being out of my environment. I was thinking about that illustration. I thought about Pastor Mark today because, he's on a trip with all the 8th grade kids from the school in Washington, D.C., and I have a feeling when he gets back, he's going to need some rest, right? I mean, it's a good thing, but it's also like we do these things that get us out of our normal routine. We want to find rest from, and yet so often we don't get the rest that we need. And the problem is that we are trying to fit into a society that tells us one thing, keep commands that God's given us, and yet knowing as sinners will fail, and then also experiencing the gifts God gives us and realizing that there's a healthy way for us to live. And all of that and that balance is difficult. Can we go to the next slide, please? Because what we often do is substitute our rules for God's rules. Jesus confronts the Pharisees about this very thing in Matthew chapter 15. So there's this time when the Pharisees are being critical. And they're being critical of Jesus and his disciples. And especially in Matthew 15, Jesus says this: "You've substituted conditions of men for the law of God." What Jesus is saying is that the Pharisees, who were the religious leaders of the day, they were the ones who knew God's law, God's word, inside and out. They added all these conditions onto it to make sure that everybody was keeping God's commands. And they lost sight of the whole reason why they were doing it. So Jesus is saying, don't get so caught up in keeping all of these rules that you're missing the point of why you're supposed to be doing the things you're trying to do or not do. Because Jesus' perspective was one of, when you have a burden, come to me, and I will give you rest. Come to me, all you who are weary, all you who labor, and find rest in me, Jesus says. You see, that was much different than the system the Pharisees were operating under. There's a section in Matthew when Jesus is talking, it says, you place all these heavy burdens on people that they can't begin to keep and carry, and you never help them do it. You just point out when they fail. And Jesus says, that's not what God designed you for. Jesus is saying that there's a rest and a peace and a freedom that come when we live in a way that God has created us to live. And that God's commands and God's rules and God's laws were given so that we live in a way that's better than if we break them. But people often forget that. In our reading today, the Pharisees call Jesus out. They say, what are your disciples doing? Why are you allowing them to do what is unlawful on the Sabbath? So the Pharisees are looking at Jesus as a rabbi and his disciples who are following and learning from him and saying, hey, Rabbi, how can you allow these students of yours to blatantly break one of God's commandments and to do nothing about it? That's what they were doing. They were basically looking at Jesus and saying, hey, how do you not know what the Ten Commandments are? And why are you letting them do that? It's very offensive. It's very much a legalistic approach. And so how Jesus responds is just incredible. Because what Jesus does is he stops them in their tracks and has them question if they really know what they're even accusing them of. Because when we look at the Sabbath and when we see how God created it, we need to go back to Genesis chapter 2. God created everything, and we're told that God does it in 6 days. And after God is done, we're told on the seventh day that God rested. So from the beginning, in the order of creation, God has given the world a rhythm of 6 days and a day of rest. God didn't need to rest because he was tired. God didn't need to rest because he just couldn't create anymore. God rested because it was a part of creation. And we're told that when God had completed what he needed to do, what he set out to do, that he rested from all that he had created and made. So, from creation to the point of where Jesus is in this story, a lot has happened. God has built this rhythm. He's given the 10 Commandments. He's set people on a path to look for a Messiah. And over that time period, the Jewish people who were very concerned about keeping God's laws and commands, because remember, they hadn't received a Messiah yet in the Old Testament leading up to Jesus. So they wanted to make sure that everything they did was to try to keep the law as perfectly as possible. Because every time they did not, they had to atone, they had to make right when they had failed. So in order to do that, they started to add a bunch of ways to help keep all of these commandments. Because the question becomes for people, what does it mean to keep the Sabbath day? Okay, so the Pharisees would say, here's what it means. God created everything, he rested. So what it means to keep the Sabbath and keep it holy is to rest. Okay, so what are you doing when you're resting? You're not working. What does it mean to not be working? Well, we would say it's pretty easy. Don't go to work. But the Pharisees start saying, yes, but there's also a number of other things that are work. Over the course of the centuries following Jesus and leading up to it, the Jewish people put in place the Talmud, which gave all of these rules and all of the commands on how to keep each thing. Just on this one thing alone, the Sabbath, there were 24 chapters of how to keep the Sabbath law. Now, you might ask, how can that be? Well, they got very specific about what not working meant. Here are some things. So, if you picked something up and you placed it down again, whatever that was, there were certain places you could and could not put it. No more could be carried than weighed more than a dried fig, or half a fig carried 2 times, in case you were, wanting to do that instead. They got very specific about what it meant to work. Students couldn't carry books. Nothing could be bought or sold. Nothing could be washed. A letter could not be sent at all, even if it was sent by somebody who wasn't Jewish. Cold water could be poured on warm, but warm could not be poured on cold. It was so specific that, they lived in a desert climate. It's hot there, hot enough outside that you can set out an egg and boil it on the sand, but you couldn't do that on the Sabbath. Literally, you could not set an egg outside and let it boil. If a candle was lit, you couldn't put it out. Point being, and here's the other one. I can't forget to say this one. So a woman couldn't wear jewelry because jewelry weighs more than a dried fig, so you would be carrying a heavier burden. I mean, they got so specific with all of these things that how could anybody keep any of them? And how could you begin to try to do all of those things every week on the Sabbath day? So when Jesus is confronted by the Pharisees, and they're questioning him about how can you let your disciples break God's commands, he turns it around. He says to them, hey, have you guys happened to have read the story about David? Well, just in Jesus saying that, he's calling them out because these guys, of course, they knew David. David's one of the heroes. They know everything about David. And so Jesus is kind of going right back at him and going, hey, this guy David, you're always holding up to this standard. Do you happen to remember the story with the high priest, with David and his men, when they ate the bread that wasn't supposed to be eaten? And of course, they would know that story, because in the Old Testament, David and his men were marching along. They needed food. They didn't have provisions. They were tired and weary. They came across this consecrated bread that was set aside, that was forbidden because it was part of the set aside for the Lord. And they ate this bread, and it was all okay. Even though they broke a rule, a command that was set in place to keep things holy for the Lord, they did it out of necessity. And in the context, Scripture tells us it's all okay. And so Jesus says, don't you remember this story? So if there are times that you can do these things, maybe you guys need to consider why that is. It would have been really easy for Jesus to say, hey, you guys have too many rules. Nobody can possibly follow them all. This is what the command actually is, and this is what it actually isn't. But instead, he used the situation to have a discussion to remind them of what the intent of a Sabbath is. So what Jesus is doing here is saying that when God created everything, when God gave us the Sabbath, he didn't do it to make us follow a bunch of things and get us all worked up and make us feel more overwhelmed by trying to keep it. He gave it to us because he knows we need it. God gives us this gift and provides rest for us in a supernatural way. God has given us this idea of knowing what our intentions are versus what his intentions are. The Pharisees' intentions on surface level were good. Try to keep everything, try to do what's right. But at the core, they had forgotten that God's Sabbath rest was something that was created for us to live in. Their intentions weren't pure. They were so concerned about being right and pointing everybody else is wrong, they missed the fact that they even needed a Messiah, needed atonement, needed rest, needed to come to God for worship. They were more concerned about how right and how good all of them were. And it can be easy for us to forget intentions. It can be easy to be passionate about things we care about current events, about things in the news, about charged topics because of our faith, and lose focus about how we're communicating, why we care, why is it so important to us. And I think it's always a good reminder for us to take a step back and recognize what it is that God gives us when he gives us his word. God is laying out for us and saying, I have created for you the best way to live. And I know that sin exists in the world. And I know that you're going to fail. But here are some ways to try to stay on track and be who I created you to be. So God gives us a list of ways to treat one another. God gives us Jesus Christ, who teaches us what it looks like to love one another. And what Jesus is saying to these Pharisees, and what we know today to be true, is he says, I'm Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus says, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Jesus says that we were created to rest. And he says, in the fulfillment of who I am, in the fulfillment of my death on the cross and my victory over it, you will have a rest that will be an eternal peace. And you can come to me and find that rest now. You know, I've mentioned a couple times since I've gotten here that there's been different points where it's been funny how God's been working in my life with the way that things are laid out with the topics. And it was no different this week. You know, here I am talking about rest and what Sabbath is, and saying that, you know, God's given us this Sabbath rest because he knows it's best for us. And he knows that we need to stop and we need to turn to him. We need to find rest from Jesus and start renewed from him. And so here I am this week, knowing Pastor Mark is going to be on this trip and others are going to be gone, and just kind of knowing like there's a lot more things I need to be aware of and in tune to, and trying to get everything done early. And then I'm working on that. I'm like pushing off, you know, Bible study and sermon prep time and things because I'm doing all these other things. Then I start working on these things and getting overwhelmed with how busy I am, not feeling like I can get everything done, and going, wait a minute. Isn't this exactly what I'm talking about not doing this week? And finding this rest and fulfillment and peace, and recognizing that from Jesus Christ, when we're restored, that it's going to be okay. So in the midst of the middle of the week, I'm still not feeling like I have everything the way I want it for this weekend. And then my grandmother, who was perfectly fine, on Thursday has a stroke. And she lives 3 hours away in Indiana. And really close, small family on that side. And so I get this call, and I go down to Indiana to see what's going on, to be with family. And the doctors kind of told us, like, she had a stroke, but we got surgery quickly, and, you know, we'll know a lot more in the next few days to few weeks. And so I drove down and back in the same day, and it was fine. It was what it was, had a peace about the situation. Then on Friday morning, I get a phone call that overnight things went horribly as bad as they could, and that things didn't go well, and that, you know, Grandma would not be, you know, recovering like we thought. And so I get this call on Friday and told, you know, essentially completely different than the day before, in the midst of all this chaos and in the midst of all of these things to do. And so I went back down, and you know what is interesting is that on Friday, when I had gotten less accomplished than I had the day before, I was able to be with family, to be with my grandma as they moved her into hospice care, and to be in prayer and in Scripture together, and just recognize that soon Grandma's going to experience everlasting rest and joy and peace with Jesus Christ. And that really the things that matter in life are often the things we don't pay as close attention to as we should. And it was just eye-opening to me to say, you know, this is why I have this message this weekend, is to preach the joy of what it means to be gathered with believers, to be gathered together, reminded of Jesus' promise to all of us, and that it's not going to always go as planned, and we don't have control over everything. But when we start from a place of rest and peace in Jesus Christ, his burden is light, and he will give us a spiritual rest and joy that we'll never know apart from him, and it will last forever. It's my prayer for each and every one of us that whatever it looks like in our lives, we take time this week and in the weeks ahead to just take a moment and to find that rest that comes from Jesus Christ. In his name, amen.